Please start.
So good evening from Kolkata. I am Dr. Soumodip Chattopadhyay, Associate Professor of Vishwabharati University and Senior Fellow at the Impact of Policy Research Institute, New Delhi. On behalf of the team of the Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies at IMPRI, I welcome you all to this City Conversation series. India's rapid urbanization, coupled with incoherent urban policies and inadequate urban infrastructure, have made the Indian cities most vulnerable to the environmental risks. Cities experience increased demand for infrastructure, higher amount of waste generation, deforestation for expansion of infrastructural facilities, including housing and change in land use pattern. Existing environmental stresses such as air pollution, degradation of greenery, and water scarcity are compounded by climate change. Moreover, the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic has already revealed the evils of decades of mismanagement of the cities. Importantly, the urban residents of the slums and the squatter settlements bear the maximum burn, and this in turn exacerbates the already existing social gaps of caste, gender, class, and location in Indian cities. And the environmental risks that the urban India faces are in fact multifaceted and are functions of local specificities and climatic conditions. So it is imperative to adjust the urban planning and governance mechanism to city-specific demands. In recent times, a whole gamut of national policies like Smart Cities Mission, Atal Mission for Rejuvenation and Urban Transformation, Swachh Bharat Mission 2015, National Clean Air Program. These have been conceived with full or partial focus to include environmental consideration into India's urban development plan and policies. At the same time, it has been observed that the perspective of viewing cities as engines of growth competes with the provision of basic human needs and sustainably managing the environmental resources of the cities. Often, the growth imperatives seem to undermine the integrated approach to environmental management in India. So the policymaker face the uphill task of balancing this climatic and environmental praxis with the growth discourses. Essentially, a question of overreaching significance is how to balance these twin objectives of optimizing growth and equipping the cities with robust social and physical infrastructure accessible by all. The Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies at IMPRI, along with Industra Global and City Makers Mission International, has launched a discussion series, the State of Cities hashtag City Conversations. And in this talk series, we have been engaging with experts on urban fields to understand the specific challenges of urbanization and how the Indian cities can be made more sustainable and inclusive. Today, we are delighted to have with us Dr. Jenia Mukherjee. Dr. Mukherjee is an assistant professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur. Her research spans environmental history, urban ecology, political ecology, and development studies. And before joining IIT Kharagpur, she was associated with the Institute of Development Studies, Kolkata. And Dr. Mukherjee received the Australian Leadership Awards Fellowship and Australian Awards Fellowship in 2010 and 2015 for her research in the chores of the local Gangetic Basin in West Bengal. She was selected as one of the 20 World Social Science Fellows by the International Social Science Council in 2013 for her work on Kolkata's canal and wetlands. And she has published papers and chapters in peer-reviewed journals and edited volumes, and has engaged in international projects on urban environmental issues. She was awarded the prestigious Carson Writing Fellowship by the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society, Munich, Germany. And she has authored several books, and the recent one is Blue Infrastructure, National History, Political Ecology and Urban Development in Kolkata. And she is the principal investigator for the AHRC ICHR funded project, the Hooghly River of Cultures pilot project from Bandel to Barakpur, as well as a project funded by EU India entitled Towards the Fluid Governance, Hydrosocial Analysis of Flood Paradigms and Management Practices in Rhone and Ganges Basins. Dr. Mukherjee today will speak on enabling comprehensive urban environmental framework in Indian cities, significance, challenge, and the way forward amidst COVID-19 pandemic. In her presentation today, she plans to demonstrate how environmental frameworks like political ecology and ecological history can offer more inclusive perspectives, facilitating just and democratic urban resilient trajectories. So again, on behalf of the team MP, I welcome you, Dr. Mukherjee, to this talk series. So now it's over to you.
All right, thank you, Professor Chattopadhyay, for this generous introduction, and also, providing the overview about this talk series and what is the agenda of this series. So I would very much like to, present, keeping in tune to the larger mission and agenda of this IMPRI talk series. So if I can just quickly start sharing my screen. Yes. So is the screen visible?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. So as Dr. Chattopadhyay already said that into this presentation, the key idea is to discuss this urban environmental frameworks, and to an extent, like I kind of try to evolve and develop an urban environmental framework by combining social sciences, urban environmental approaches like environmental history and political ecology. And through one particular case study, I would basically, again, like with the focus on Kolkata, I would like to discuss that why urban social sciences approaches, urban environmental social sciences paradigms are very important in order to design, develop, and innovate inclusive cities. Because again, as Professor Chattopadhyay rightly mentioned at the very beginning, that the major challenge is how to address this twin objective of of economic growth or urban growth on one hand, and on the other to kind of make this physical and social infrastructures accessible by all. So this is a real challenge, and this challenge has become more challenging within the context of the pandemic. So I would like to before I directly move into this urban social science approaches. I think it will be important for me also to talk about the background, or being a student of history. I think it's very important for all of us to understand the historical context which we are encountering right now. So this is the era of planetary urbanization, but more importantly, this is also the era of the planetary boundaries, or the transgression of the 9 planetary boundaries, as Johan Rockström and his team from the Stockholm Resilience Center pointed out in 2009. So I would like to bring your attention to this, to what I call overlapping scenes. So this is the overlapping scenes, and we need to understand the interconnections among these scenes, which to a great extent determine the contemporary scene or scenario. So this is the Anthropocene, where all these planetary boundaries are getting transgressed at an accelerated pace, which is unfortunate. There are one or two positive stories, for example, in terms of the ozone layer depletion, because I think the Montreal Protocol really, it had a positive impact on managing the ozone layer. But so far as the other planetary boundaries are concerned, like change in land use, or for that matter freshwater supply, you can see that how these planetary boundaries are really getting crossed at a very fast pace. But another important thing is that Jason Moore, he came up with the concept of the capitalocene, when he pointed out that Anthropocene is actually not neutral. So by this, what I mean is that it is important for us to understand the interconnections between the functioning of the capitalist engine and its impact on the 9 planetary boundaries. So this is the capitalist system, the functioning of the capitalist system, the functioning of the capitalist engine, that is kind of intensifying these risks, and facilitating this transgression of these 9 planetary boundaries that the Stockholm Resilience Center is talking about. Again, another major thing is that this there's one particular article which I would like to mention here. So this is a very recent article which came out in 2019, written by Eduardo Mendieta. And Mendieta said that the anthropogenesis is urbanogenesis. So what does that mean? So now we also, we have a lot of discussions and exchanges among urban experts. For example, there is Tua Mint, who says now this is actually the era of the urban Anthropocene. Lusol says no, this is Urbanocene, and Mendieta pointing out that anthropogenesis is urbanogenesis. So the key idea is that from when did this Anthropocene actually start? Again, there are controversies, there are kind of debates among scholars, among geologists more specifically, about the date of the Anthropocene. But and like there are this chronological controversies. But one important thing is that 1950s can be considered as a landmark period. If geologically also, if you take a detailed look on the stratigraphic signatures of planet Earth, you will understand that from that time significant biophysical processes on Earth system actually started. So, and if you see 1950s, it is also the period from when mega urbanization or hyper urbanization also started happening. So, for example, since 1945, the number of megacities have increased from 2 to 45. So I think it will not be an exaggeration if we say that urbanization is also an indicator of the current amplitude of the Anthropocene. So what I wanted to do in the very first slide is to kind of talk about these scenes and their interconnections, how Anthropocene, Capitalocene, and Urbanocene are intricately intertwined with each other, and how it is important for us to understand their integration and then contextualize the contemporary challenges within this larger template of the overlapping scenes. So yes, so with this, I would like to move on, to this next slide, where I would like you to focus on, the shifting geographies of urbanization. So what is so dramatic about the contemporary urbanization is its rate, scale, and most importantly, shifting geographies of urbanization. So by this, I mean that, how this, the cities of the global South, they are becoming urbanized. So, and I think since late 1980s and early 1990s, a lot of research has been done on this. For example, there are very renowned political scientists and geographers, people like David Harvey and Joseph Gugler. So Joseph Gugler writing this phenomenal book on third world urbanization. And later, Mike Davis, he also wrote this particular article called Planet of Slums. Later, it also became a monograph. And in this particular write-up, Planet of Slums, Mike Davis talks about the additional vulnerabilities that the cities of the global South actually face. So he drew our attention to what he says, urbanization without growth. And then Adriana Allen, she is a more, she is a contemporary researcher, and she conceptualized what she called peri-urban. So she shed a lot of light on this process of peri-urbanization, and in very lucid language, she pointed out that what is this peri-urban space. So she said, a particular space which was rural yesterday and which will become urban tomorrow. So that space is the peri-urban space. And she said that though this the one of the major characteristics of this mega urbanization in these developing cities is that though this these areas, the rural areas, are increasingly getting incorporated within the larger ambit of municipal corporation, but unfortunately at the same time, as they're little remote, they lack basic infrastructure. So basic infrastructure in the form of piped drinking water network, sanitation network, etc. So she explains and she kind of considers this peri-urbanization process as urbanization without infrastructures. And again, I talked about Mendieta. So Mendieta also draws our attention to mega urbanization and analyzes, the nitty-gritties of mega urbanization, talking about the various challenges of mega urbanization for these developing cities of global south, and especially during this era of the 21st century, which already has so many challenges in terms of demographic explosion. So now we have like 9 billion humans inhabiting planet Earth, and in terms of global environmental change, climate change, and also economic volatility. And I think like another major thing about today's urbanization or urbanization challenge is that our cities are both consumption cities and consumerist cities. So by this, I mean that, the cities are really expanding their contours by swallowing and gobbling up or consuming, their larger ecological infrastructures in terms of water bodies, arable lands, pasture lands, wetlands, etc. So they are consumption cities. And on the other hand, like the ecological footprint of the citizens of urban people are much higher, than people inhabiting rural areas. So our cities are both consumption and consumerist cities. And unfortunately, again, there is the paradox of the great divide between consumerism and deprivation. Again, in these, mega urban metropolitan spaces, because we know that, how only a small section who belong to the upper echelons of the society, they can afford to consume a lot of resources, etc. But on the other hand, how the people inhabiting slums and squatters, they are even deprived from basic urban amenities. So these cities also, they are icons of, they symbolize this paradox of the great divide between consumerism on one hand and deprivation on the other. So coming to COVID, and I think UN Habitat declared like 3-4 months back that COVID-19, of course, is an urban-centric disease, because 95% of the cases are urban cases. So out of like 210 countries, 30 cities, they are now affected. The people are affected with COVID-19. And all of us know that, how all these very important, metropolitan cities, they are so much internationally connected to each other. So I read an article, a recent article again by Robert Wallace, where Robert Wallace also kind of designated COVID as a neoliberal disease. And here he says that what were once local spillovers and now epidemics trawling their way through global waves of travel and trade. So we can understand that how how globalization and global travel to a great extent it has fostered this transmission of diseases across various cities. And I think that the challenges of the cities of the global south have become extremely visible and prominent within the context of COVID-19, and I'll explain why. When COVID, the outbreak took place in November, December, and then when from February, it was quite a phenomenon within the Indian subcontinent as well. I think the researchers were not really focusing a lot on the issue of urban informality. But from the end of March, I could trace two important research institutes really, placing a lot of focus, discussing a lot about, these additional challenges of COVID-19 for urban informal settlements. And these two research institutes are IIED, which is International Institute of Environmental Development, and IDS. Both of these are in UK, so Institute of Development Studies. And I'm sorry for this particular slide. It might appear to be a little dense in terms of text, but I think all these words are very, very important. And these two quotations are really important, but because these two quotes, they capture the crux or the essence of challenges for urban informal settlements in terms of facing or encountering corona. So the first one again is from Anna Wilkinson. So Anna Wilkinson is a researcher based at IIED, and she says that as we in the global north brace ourselves for the coronavirus pandemic, we are being told to wash our hands for 20 seconds and self-isolate if sick. But what if you cannot do either of those things? 1 billion people live in slums or informal settlements where water for basic needs is in short supply, let alone 20 seconds worth, and where space is constrained and rooms are often shared. Yet discussion about vulnerability in this context has been startlingly absent. And another writer by Favor and Takoli, again researchers at IIED. So they said densely packed urban environments where humans live alongside bats, rodents, birds, pets, and domestic animals are especially fertile grounds for the spread of new disease. Here, viruses or indeed other pathogens can easily jump from species to species and evolve to be infectious to multiple hosts. So we can understand the challenges for these urban informal settlements where basic amenities are still absent. So I with one of my colleagues, Amrita, I don't know, Amrita was supposed to be here today. I don't know whether she's watching us or not. But yes, Amrita also Amrita specializes in political ecology, and she has a lot of grip on urban sociology as well. So both of us, we could write, we could write an opinionated article for ORF, and where we try to understand COVID-19 as a classic case of wicked problem. So wicked problem, it means that it's a kind of, it's a tangled mess of thread where one remains confused that which thread one needs to pull the first. So that is the nature of wicked problem. And again, another characteristic of wicked problem is that it keeps recurring unless it is addressed in its root. So if you see this illustration, I'm sorry, I think it's not very clear, but still if you can focus on this diagram and mainly focus on these circular rows. So the circular arrows between requirements and limits for each stage, pre-outbreak, outbreak, and post-outbreak, suggest that the problem will continue recurring unless interventions are effectively planned and implemented. Right. So, for example, the pre-outbreak stage, the requirement was washing hands frequently and social distancing. And unfortunately, the limits right now in the urban informal settlements are lack of adequate water and densely packed tenements. So now, if these limits are there, then the requirement does not get fulfilled. So, and as the requirement does not get fulfilled, so the problem continues. So how are we going to manage, or how are we going to implement safety measures if we lack, these basic physical infrastructures? So, so unfortunately, it will keep recurring as a vicious cycle. And what we so the way we try to understand COVID-19 as a wicked problem, I think now some more studies and more researchers are pouring in, kind of validating our case. And I could again access a very recent article, a very interesting one, which has been published in the journal called Local Environment by Wasdani and Prasad. And it's very interesting that one of these authors, she got an opportunity to just informally make some visits to urban informal settlements in Bangalore, because one of her friends was a government official. So these people, they were kind of trying to mobilize or trying to create awareness in these squatters in Bangalore. So she got a chance to visit some of these settlements, and after a lot of observations, and in that article, she explains her experience and kind of compiled all the observations that she made, in these visits. And the conclusion is very alarming. Finally she concludes, finally both of them, in this article, they have concluded by saying that social distancing, it remains an aspiration, and it cannot be an attainable reality against the lack of concomitant economic support being provided to the most socially vulnerable and marginalized sections of the community. So they've shown that. And this is from Dharavi. And all of us know that, for example, in India, the population, if you look into the population density, it is like 384% per square kilometer. But take the case of Dharavi, it becomes like 3,35,907 per square kilometer. So one can understand, the density of population for these squatters and slums. Again, so there is definitely a correlation between deprivation and lack of entitlement and vulnerability to COVID transmission. And Mishra, Gayan and Haq, they have identified a set of deprivation variables that make the already deprived sections more deprived to the challenges of COVID-19. So yes, now I think very quickly I would talk about why do we also need to think about disasters, and how we also need to perceive these developing cities as disasterscapes facing disruptive risks. So I'll explain. So for example, again, these urban informal settlements, all these things that you see here, eviction and displacement, crime, criminal cartels, fire, lack of utilities, flooding, inadequate housing arrangements, space, materials. So if all these components together make these spaces disasterscapes, because here, if there is any hazard, immediately it will get translated into a disaster, because hazard will get complemented with vulnerability. And disruptive risk, what is that? That already in the middle of the pandemic, this Beirut explosion took place, explosion of ammonium nitrate in the port city of Beirut, which is the capital of Lebanon. And all of us know that how transmission just spiked in the middle of this crisis. Same thing happened so far as Amphan is concerned. So when Amphan battered this Eastern Indian coast, again, the authorities, they were really having a tough time to think about how to manage risks. And now I think we need to be more prepared, because we are now we are already now in the middle of this disruptive risk, and more we will face these kind of risks more frequently. So our resilience or our our responses to these disruptive risks need to be thought upon, and need to be like the mechanisms need to be innovated in a more spontaneous manner. And like we really have to have alternative mechanisms through which we'll be able to kind of cope to this kind of coupled socio-ecological crisis. So no more, I think, resilience, top-down resilient model will work. We have to think about disruptive resilience against contemporary disruptive risks. So with this, very quickly, I would discuss that what is the situation here. So what is going on, so far as the Indian subcontinent is concerned. All of us know that India has planned. India has a grand plan and an agenda for this 100 smart cities, because this was the NDA proclamation in 2013, where the NDA government announced that between 2015 and 2020, an amount, a lump sum amount of rupees 480 billion would be kind of dispersed to the urban local bodies, and for this coming up of the smart cities. And these smart cities, they would be technology enabled. So artificial intelligence and technology, several other smart infrastructures and schemes are very significant components of this smart city scheme. But again, it is very important for us not to get carried away with these contemporary plans and proposals, but to historically and political historically and also like politically contextualize these plans and this mission within the larger scene of Indian urban pathway or trajectory. So, for example, in this particular edited volume, which came out in 2018, so I kind of tried to, I tried to talk about this. I traced the Indian urban trajectory since the post-independence period, which also like converges with the post-Second World War period, which is again the post-materialist period for the West. But unfortunately, like the development discourse was imposed upon us, and we also started importing a lot of concepts from the West, and like for cyborg city, ubiquitous eco cities, compact cities, high density cities, etc., etc. And I think to a great extent, like India, for example, India also started designing her newly planned cities during the time of Nehru, and then followed by this sustainable city programs of 1980s, and then JNNURM, and finally JNNURM being replaced with the NDA Smart City scheme or mission. So I think to a great extent, all these plans, and especially the smart city mission, to a great extent is in tune to the gospel of sustainable urbanization, which is the post-2015 development agenda of the United Nations. And again, as Professor Chattopadhyay mentioned, that like cities are visualized as engines of growth. So and unfortunately, this kind of definition misses out the very fact that by their very own definition, cities are not self-sufficient, because they are dependent on their larger rural hinterlands and peri-urban interface. But unfortunately, there is so much of hue and cry relating to the growth and prosperity of cities, and how cities are important for the GDP of a particular country. The urban metabolism perspective, gets absolutely relegated in the corner. So yes, when the smart city program was launched, or this mission was launched, a stormy upsurge swept at least the Indian academic scene, because there are a lot of controversies, there are a lot of like debates about like whether how smart this smart city concept is, and a lot of debates on the issue of inclusion. But till date, we really don't have a lot of focus on the environmental perspective, because unfortunately, it is believed that this green, the element of green is already, imbricated within the concept of the smart city plan. But unfortunately, I would like to, like to talk about a disclaimer, and I would provide a caution or a note of warning by saying that the kind of eco-friendliness that this smart city initiatives are talking about, this eco-friendliness, at best, they are part of this ecology in cities concept. They, unfortunately, this eco-friendliness has not been able to surpass ecology in cities and kind of come up with or formulate long-term ecological resilient planning, which to a great extent can accomplish the larger agenda of ecology of cities. I will explain it a bit more because this is important. So I think like if, for example, if I just give an example of Rajarhat. So what happened is that, Rajarhat, again, which is an IT hub, which is a newly planned city on the outskirts of Kolkata. So initially, the central government was interested to make Rajarhat a smart city. But as we all know that there are always like conflicts and feuds between the state government and the state machinery and the central government. So the state had different plan for Rajarhat, and the state said that no, Rajarhat is going to be a green city. So, and this was mediatized, etc., etc. And immediately, I mean, there was like rounds of applause, and people were quite happy and content that Rajarhat has become a green city. And how? Because like under the HIDCO chairman Debashish Sen, 10,000 saplings have been planted in Rajarhat. But nobody even questioned that Rajarhat actually was designed by converting the wetlands, which did lot of harm to the fishers, to the farmers, to the local people, and also disrupted the sustainable flows between the city of Kolkata and again its larger ecological settings in the form of wetlands and in the form of farmlands. So we never questioned it. And unfortunately, we were happy that Rajarhat is a green city. So I think that the kind of green that we are talking about, or the kind of green which remains an important component in the smart city design, these at best they can be explained in terms of ecology in cities. So where the focus is absolutely within cities. And if you see this illustration again, so where the disciplinary focus is on biotic and patch matrix. But this will not be sufficient for the long-term survival of cities and its larger hinterlands, because it will be important for us to understand the entire region from the urban mosaic perspective, where urban mosaic is understood as ACS, as functioning of social ecological systems. So finally, the final aim would be to kind of forge ecology for cities through transdisciplinary and transsectoral co-production of knowledge and co-design of actions. So this is unfortunately what is absolutely missing in our cities and also in the smart city program. So with this, I would now finally, I mean, this is the last part of the presentation. And so where I would like to focus on one particular urban environmental framework, which I found to be very significant for my own empirical research on Kolkata. And I think that this particular framework, it also has potentials to be applied at city scales. I mean, it can be applied at scales, it can be applied for other contexts as well. So what is this? What is this? I think I'll take a couple of minutes on this slide, if it is okay with you, sir. So I take your permission, Chattopadhyay sir, and then I would like to spend 3-4 minutes. Okay. Thank you. So, so this framework, which is this historical urban political ecology, so it combines. So here I combine urban environmental history with urban political ecology. So historical urban political ecology is a cross-fertilized framework combining urban environmental history and urban political ecology. Now, what is this urban environmental history? So when environmental history, it started its career, it emerged. So it never talked about urban. So urban was never there in the discussion. And always, like for example, in urban scholarship, there was there was a dearth of literature on environment and vice versa. So cities were always understood as antithetical to nature. But this perspective started changing. And from 1990s in the United States first, and then subsequently in Europe, the environmental historians, they started arguing that this is we are not doing justice to the field of environmental history, because cities are also integral part of the larger environment. How can we miss cities from the discussion on environment, and how can environmentalists also not shed light on the urban dynamics? So in that way, cities were incorporated in environmental history, where historians, they started writing on the history of emergence of networked infrastructures. So like, again, piped networks connecting the cities, providing drinking water to the citizens, and also like how, especially in Europe, like how these worries and anxieties about health and hygiene. So the miasma theory or the bacteriology theory. So how Europe became very polluted with industrial revolution. and how it was imperative for the urban municipal governments to be more to come up with more robust and sophisticated mechanisms through which drinking water could be provided to people, and through which waste could be actually disposed. So I mean, that's the context that kind of led to the birth of modern so-called sanitary cities. So these urban environmental historians, they brought our attention, to those to that historical juncture or conjecture. And these historians, they also address the intersections among city, nature, and technology. So there are fascinating works and fascinating books on urban environmental history on different cities like Chicago, like New York, and so far Europe is concerned, like on France, on Finland, etc., etc. On the other hand, urban political ecology, it is an offshoot of political ecology. So political ecology, it's a framework, or it's a domain or a field which makes us aware about the fact that environmental resources, the challenges are not only in terms of availability, but the challenges are also in terms of access. So who are the gainers, who are the losers? Who make decisions? How technological choices are made? So like the power equations among the stakeholders, the power equations among multiple social actors. So how and why it is so important to understand this power dynamics among these various social actors when we discuss access to, or we discuss like distribution of environmental resources. So this is all about like political ecology, and like urban political ecology is also about access or distribution of ecological resources in urban areas, in urban settings, by understanding I mean, by a more nuanced exploration and understanding of power dynamics among multiple social actors in a particular urban setting. So like so what happened is that like in India also, like urban environmental history, it has just begun its journey. We have few books and 2-3 articles on this. And urban political ecology is an established field. Lot of people doing a lot of research like on sewerage networks and pollution, etc., etc. But what is important is that in urban environmental history, the contemporary parts, the analysis, the analysis of recent dynamics remain missing. On the other hand, in urban political ecology, they don't really stretch the story or push the frontiers, to like maybe 100 years or 200 years back. They don't do that because they are not trained as historians. So what I tried to do is that I thought that combining these two fields would be very, very important to analyze the urban environmental trajectory of a particular city. So what happens is that in HUBE, like history provides long-term temporal scale to political ecology. So I am discussing like power equations. I am discussing the the mediations across various actors. But then I am stretching the story from its very beginning. So I am providing a temporal scale to this urban ecological dynamics. On the other hand, political ecology, which enables us to understand the mediation. So I did not deliberately use the term conflict, but I used mediations, because I will explain that how through my case study, I could understand that it's not always hierarchical, power dynamics or equations, because sometimes there are collaborations, sometimes there are bargains, sometimes there are negotiations. So it's not only, the unilinear presence of like conflicts across multiple actors, but there are also multiple lessons of collaborations and overlapping interests. So that is why I use this particular term called mediation. So political ecology, enables historians to understand this mediation across actors. And so when historians, they discuss or they from the archives, they try to find out how different agencies were set up, how like different social actors were engaged, in the environmental stories. So they also try to apply the political ecology framework to see, the messy politics among the multiple stakeholders. So, and this becomes very enthralling when it is applied in the field of urban studies, because urban itself, it's an enthralling field, and this becomes even more exciting within context of delta cities like Kolkata. And this book, my recent book, which came out this year in June, so it's all about this application of this HUBE framework or methodology for the empirical context of Kolkata. And so this is the empirical context of Kolkata, and this book discusses the changing trajectories of canals and wetlands, for the city of Kolkata. And why this is so important, because I think HUBE also blurs or sometimes kind of dismantles the conventional ideas and ideologies and approaches so far as the delta city is concerned, because for example, Debjani Bhattacharya, who is based at the Drexel University, so she wrote a book in 2018 called Empire and Ecology in the Bengal Delta. And in that book, she mentioned that the British, when they took up the Kolkata project, they only thought about their short-term benefits, because they did not calculate the risks or the environmental vagaries that this particular city would face, because it is situated on a delta. So she criticized the colonial project of Kolkata's urbanization, and she said that today the way real estate speculation is going on in the eastern part of Kolkata, it is the same age-old legacy of the colonial continued capitalist effort of capitalizing on land. So, so this is Debjanidi's argument, and many people support her. I also am a great admirer of Debjanidi's work and this book in particular. But then I was also trained by the sanitation engineer Dhrubajyoti Ghosh, and I think all of us more or less know him, because he is also known as the father of the East Kolkata wetlands, because he throughout his life he spent his whole life by studying these ecological complexities in East Kolkata wetlands, how wastewater gets recycled. And so people like Dhrubajyoti Ghosh and Ashish Ghosh also, when I talked to them, they told me that Kolkata is a blessed city, because it is an ecologically subsidized city, because it has as it is on the delta, so it has river Bhagirathi Hooghly taking care of her drinking water needs. Initially, river Vidyadhari acted as the outfall channel for the city of Kolkata. Then, when Vidyadhari died, another a distributary of the Ganga, Kulti, became the outfall channel. And then these marshes, the eastern marshes, the wetlands, these boglands are there. So, Kolkata is such an affordable city, because till date, Kolkata does not have a separate sewage treatment plant, and East Kolkata wetland every day connected to the primary canals and also the inlet canals recycle 750 million liters of waste per day and generate 150 tons of vegetables and 22 tons of fish. So isn't it a blessing or not? So then what should be the conclusion? Is Kolkata a risky city, or is it a resilient city? So this book, Blue Infrastructures, through Blue Infrastructure, I try to kind of address this particular question. And it was not an easy question, I must say. And actually, I spent more than 10 years. And I finished my PhD in 2010. I started my PhD in Jadavpur in 2007. I finished it in 2010. But I could finally start working on my book in 2019. And I finished my book in 2020. So it's a period of 10 years. And for 10 years, I remained confused that, whether Kolkata is really a risky city or is it a resilient city. And finally, I think finally finally HUBE is actually the methodology which I found to be very, very useful, because so the methodology, it combines archival research and ethnography. So when I listen to the irrigation officials or the Kolkata municipal, the engineers, and then for example, the KMDA officials, and then the people who are associated with the Department of Fisheries. So when I talk to these different people, so they provided very interesting stories about how the system works, how this entire sewerage sanitation of Kolkata actually work, and how the entire flood efficacy of the city of Kolkata is dependent on this particular system. And I also talked to the people, the local people, who the fishers in these wetlands. And again, I want to draw a note of caution that they are not homogeneous. So a fisher in a very big cooperative fishery, his socioeconomic profile and everything is so very different from a fisher working in a small, public, in a small private fishery. So there are different fisheries, private fisheries, government fisheries, cooperative fisheries. So each fishery has its own narrative. So I collected all these stories, and as like I was trained in the field of history, so I had exposure to archives, because that is what I did during my PhD. So then I complemented archival data with ethnographic data, and finally concluded in the book that media and several other reports project this story absolutely from the perspective of binary, where on one hand the state is the state is madly obsessed with its pro-developmentalist vision, and on the other hand the locals, so the locals, this is used, that the locals to a great extent being supported by the civil society or the environmentalists, they want to conserve the wetlands. So this is again, so this typical like development versus conservation ideas cheap into the story, but that is not the true story, because this is a very linear story. And like Hube help us to kind of map both potentials and challenges for the city of Kolkata. It makes the invisible feedback loops visible. And I think this is a very important methodology in terms of making us understand that resilience is also very much there. It is embedded in the deltaic city of Kolkata. So if we think about, if we are thinking on the lines of resilient planning, we have to think about resilience, because we have to think about the spontaneous emergence of resilience, where resilience has to be a bottom-up approach. We cannot impose resilience, just by kind of incorporating it within the urban environmental planning discourse. But we have to have a larger and better understanding of the making and shaping of urban nature when we are thinking in terms of risk. So I'll just stop here. So this is just an illustration which shows that why, exchange flows need to be channelized across various sectors. So it's not only transdisciplinary knowledge, but different disciplines should come together to kind of to make us understand complex system in a better way, so that we can collectively understand complex systems. But I think it is also very important for different sectors like academia, civil society, GROs, policy circles, to come together to share their own stories in their own way. And also it is very important for us to kind of craft a common language of conversation, because we are writing these books which are getting published from Oxford or Springer, but a policymaker cannot be interested in that book, though it is academically very valuable. Same thing, we are not very sympathetic to listen to their stories, because always we see, or we try to understand political ecologists especially, and forgive me for this, but political ecologists consider policymakers as class enemies. So, so there is a mismatch. So I think it is important to channelize these exchange flows where we remain more compassionate to each other. Yes, is Kolkata wetlands, the hectares are getting converted, no doubt about that, but also the system is running for so many years. And there are so many overlaps. I mean, the irrigation department, the KMC, the KMDA, Department of Fisheries, the local Fishermen's Association, all of them, they cooperate also. There are stories of cooperation. Every month meetings are held, so where people try to listen to each other. So it is also very important to kind of highlight these positive stories, beyond, just beyond only narrating declensionist narratives. So I think these exchange flows remain very important, through which we can nurture and harness sustainable flows between cities and its larger ecological infrastructure. And finally, VUE provides a lot of scope to come up with this robust resilience matrix by mapping both challenges and potentials, that are there, that are very much embedded within the geomorphological and social context of particular urban settings. So this is the final slide. If you remember, like I already showed part of this illustration, and I said that the wicked problems will keep recurring unless effective planning is not implemented. And here, another column is there, and where the focus is, where I would like to say that COVID-19 definitely is a challenge. It has badly infected the SDGs, no doubt about that. But at the same time, I think it's also an opportunity, because it provokes us to reconceptualize urban nature, and also to rethink and restructure urban informal settlements, paying heed to or in tune to the sustainable development goals. Because in any case, we have to implement this by 2030. And now we know that why implementing this remains so very important. And we will not be able to do it again in that top-down fashion. Yes, technology can play a big role, but technology is not the last word. So it is very important to learn lessons from what is going on in the field. Some NGOs and GROs are really doing very good work. So these NGOs and GROs need to be capacitated. And finally, I think it's high time to kind of like address the intersections between conceptual empirical, theoretical practical, and epistemological axiological approaches. So no more we can say that, for example, I cannot say that I am an academician, so I will only formulate perspective for action, and the civil society will kind of craft these actions. No, all of us together, I think it has to be a collective venture for all of us, and we will be able to do this with our distinct expertise, but at the same time the expertise which will enable all of us to learn from each other through very meaningful and rigorous exchanges. So this is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Mukherjee, for your extremely insightful presentation, because in your presentation you have not only provided the nature or the nuances of the problems that currently the Indian cities are facing, but also provides a framework, theoretical framework, which will be useful for analyzing the problems in greater detail, and also to offer some of the possible solutions. For example, you have drawn our attention to the rate, scale, and shifting geographies of urbanization, and specifically the additional vulnerabilities that the cities of Global South are facing. And India is also no exception to this trend. And you also mentioned about peri-urbanization, that means urbanization without essentially the infrastructure, the basic amenities. And you have said many things, but definitely the thing is that in the context of India also, what we are actually experiencing is that the cities are expanding at the expense of destroying the environment. So we have a typical paradox. You also mentioned about the paradox of great divide between the consumerism and the deprivation to some extent, which is related to this aspect. And the most important point, not most important, but one of the most important point which you have mentioned is the problems of urban informalities, which is a very important feature of the Indian cities, and the challenges that these urban informal settlements face. These challenges have compounded following this outbreak of the COVID-19. In fact, you mentioned COVID-19 as a classic wicked problem, where we have seen the clear mismatch between the requirements for prevention as well as the available infrastructural facilities which are there in the cities. And you have rightly pointed out, because there are many, I think I have even come across 2 or 3 write-ups, academic write-ups, which have shown that density as in contrast to our popular perception that density is not the only contributor to this expansion of this COVID-19 outbreak. Rather, the places where densities collide with the poverty become more and more vulnerable for this outbreak. And not only this is not only true for COVID-19. This is true for any kind of any such infectious diseases. And you have rightly pointed out the need for an innovative alternative mechanisms to cope with these socio-ecological crises which are associated with urbanization, which in the context of India hitherto is a sort of unsustainable in nature. And also you have pointed out the insufficiency of the so-called green concept in our in our popular discourse of the smart cities mechanism. And finally you mentioned the historical urban political ecology. So even I am also I just know a great deal of it, and I would like to know more in detail maybe later on, because I found it very interesting, this historical urban political ecology. It is, as you mentioned, that it is a framework which will be helpful for us to understand the urban environmental trajectory of the cities. And you have also at the same time mentioned that this is embedded, the embeddedness of the resilience in the city planning discourse, the historical urban political ecology. And obviously, so this urban political ecological HUEF framework, if I say HUEF framework, is very much important for us to understand the nuances of or the differences between the pro-developmentalist objective of the state vis-a-vis the normal environmental concerns of the local people. And then finally you have pointed out that the typical top-down approach will not provide us any sustainable solution. We need to think in a bit newer way. A lot of emphasis should be put on the collective action perspective, because being a student of economics, we generally term these as the points which we have mentioned. They are in the context of multiple actors in the urban governance framework in India. So this is a sort of collective actions which we need to be which we need to put much more emphasis on. So these are some of the thoughts which have come out from your lecture. So now let me just see if there are certain questions or not. I have a couple of questions. These are more or less related to the presentations which you have made. So you may choose to answer all of them, or you may choose to answer later on, no problem. But before that, may I ask Arjun, the director of IMPRI, to chip in, and if he wants to make any observation or comments on Dr. Mukherjee's presentation. Is Arjun there?
Sir, I am here. I think
okay.
Simi will make a point.
Okay.
Simi, are you there? We also have Samir, sir.
Yes.
Samir Unale, sir.
Okay.
We can also bring Samir Unale, sir. Yes. And
okay.
also to the panelist.
Okay, sure. So,
Denia ma'am, would you like to reflect upon what Samir told?
No. I just
sir has provided a wonderful summary of the lecture. And
no, so let me just ask you, since we have time. So I think I have some specific questions. Okay. So first of all, well, you have mentioned about this HUEF framework. So could you please elaborate on how do the environmental concerns, for example, you discussed something about the grid infrastructure. So how do the environmental concerns align with the economic growth perspective and ecological perspective, making these Indian cities climate resilient? And how far any sort of environmental planning linked to the city development plan? This is question number one. And another question is, what are the potential of current official policies? Obviously, you have mentioned the inadequacy of our smart cities framework, but there are many other policies. So what are the potential of the current official policies of the different government levels to make significant interventions towards making the cities sort of climate resilient? And thirdly, definitely we know that there are lots of actors which are involved in the urban policymaking in India. There are central government, there are state government, there are city government, parastatal agencies are there are special purpose vehicles, and then we have the influence of the international donor organizations, NGOs, CBOs, but all of them, they generally come up with certain different political resources and different political concerns. So what do you see? What could be the roles of these different sets of actors with different political resources in framing and implementing the this city development plan, keeping in view these environmental concerns which we are discussing about? What are the specific concerns? For example, will it be the preservation of local environment, or say the infrastructural services with special emphasis on smart technologies or economic growth? What are the specific concerns each of these actors they generally aim to address, and what could be the different modes of collaboration among these different actors? Because you also mentioned about there is a greater need of more and more deliberations and collaboration among these different sets of actors. So what are the different modes, or what could be the different modes of collaboration among these different actors, and how they shape ultimately the environmental infrastructural actions which shape the Indian cities, and how far the existing city government's framework is actually suitable for facilitating such climate resilient action plan. And finally, my final question is that we all know that local innovation is very important for planning any resilient, for building any resilient cities or some cities or so. So what do you think? What are the community's knowledge and perception? Because you have worked with the communities at the local level. So what are the community's knowledge and perception about these environmental concerns, and what are the indigenous methods that can be applied to make the cities more and more resilient? How can local knowledge and indigenous responses then can be incorporated within the existing official policy narratives? So these are some of the questions which I have in my mind. So you may choose to answer either all of them, or maybe throw some lights on some of the issues.
Yes. Just to save some time, let me also add few questions, because similar ones. Yes. First, let me congratulate Prasam Mukherjee to sharing her thoughts and a plethora of works, decades of her work here, and also reflecting upon this this Corona time. Many issues ma'am has really tried to touch upon and highlight. I also really wanted to touch upon few things that this environment framework, especially in this pandemic, also opens up, since India is at a good scale of urbanization. We have the aspiration of 100 smart cities and so on. And in the second phase, we are thinking that all cities should be smart. Many movements in that direction. I also, many things ma'am has also raised from theory, and Soumyadeep sir has really touched upon those. I really wanted to raise this question of parastatals or multiplicity of agencies or institutions. Ma'am really highlighted that during her field work, she has interacted with so many of the stakeholders, and highlighted that how cities are resilient. One thing which I really liked about Kolkata, that more than resilient, Kolkata is affordable. So that was something, yes, really. Hyderabad also, very affordable. That part really, things are moving on. But as we know, in state government, in central government, we have environment department. But in cities or the municipal administration, also this town planning, nothing, no lever as such for environment per se. We have solid waste, liquid. So how do you see this institution and agency coming up and taking upon this framework? Because that really becomes a part of regional planning, be it environment policy or action, EIA draft, so many things. There are various projects, ma'am has really touched upon smart cities, Amrut and all those things. Now, these infrastructure projects which are also coming, be it pertaining to the built environment or be it also for metros or highways. Again, there is so much of multiplicity of institution. Ma'am, how do you see that happening? Most of the cases also now we have foreign consultants, foreign players making our roads and infrastructure. And when we see our sewerage or other things already in apathy, and and solid waste workers, so many of things going on. How do you see that that thing going on. And then really, ma'am has highlighted that on that wicked urbanization choice, ma'am has said that we really need to have disruptive urban ideas or urban things. Ma'am, what are those disruptive ideas? What can be really done as the way forward? And what do you think in terms of policy, learning upon this framework and all so theories and all the recent work you have mentioned? What should be the direction in terms of policy? Do we need national cities policy? Rather than city for city oriented growth, what should be done? We have Amrut, Swachh Bharat, NULM, Hriday, smart city, and the nature of projects are not changing. We are stuck into the bureaucracy or engineering city. Lastly, I really wanted to ask Soumyadeep sir, as also we have also looking for COVID, there are also a lot of green financing in Europe. A lot of money has been raised through those sort of bonds for green infrastructure. How do you see in terms of financing what should be done going forward? Most of our projects and others are also. Soumyadeep sir has also written recently on this green financing and these major issues. A huge chunk of money, but in case of India, solar and other, that has also, I would say, plateaued or not moving ahead. So, ma'am, where do you see, ma'am? Yes, you can really choose to answer.
Yes, no. I think these are major issues which both of you have touched upon, and I would be very brief because, like, for example, the main thing which I think is that we really need to pay a lot of attention to is the fact that each city has its own narrative, and the same size does not fit all. So that is the mistake we are making. I mean, deliberately we are making, because I can't believe, I mean, it's my inner conviction that, and not only my inner conviction, my inner conviction is very much validated by empirical facts and figures. So I think, like, if you see this budget, you see the budgetary allocations, you will understand that how, to a great extent, corporate giants and the IT lobbies, they are very much involved in the story, and which is not a bad thing. But then, unfortunately, like, lot of the basic things are just getting ignored and missed out, because those local potentials, they were not incorporated in urban environmental planning, and they are not also incorporated in this current smart city plan. And there are a lot of works specifically, shedding light on particular cities like Lavasa, for example, that, what are the problems associated with Lavasa. If we also take into consideration the pre-implementation, implementation, and post-implementation, stages of these newly built cities. So this is one. Second is that, so the major point is that we like, for example, the book that I talked about, the edited volume called Sustainable Urbanization in India, Challenges and Opportunities. So in that book, there are like 20 book chapters. There are 20 chapters on different cities of India. And the idea, the major aim of this book was to capture the micro-political processes that shape urban nature. So we really, the story of Patna is so very different from the story of Kolkata. The story of Bangalore is so very different from the story of Lucknow. So we really have to, understand that. So we cannot really kind of lay out a 20-point provision or prescription and see and say that, see here, these are the recommendations and which should be implemented at scales. No, it cannot work like that. So this is my first point. The second is that, about climate change and cities. I think though number of discussions are going on this, but still we don't have any concrete plan. We don't have, I mean, this is a very, this is a new area, new domain, because climate change and cities, Indian cities, climate change and Indian cities, it's a very new domain. Though like some of the Indian cities, including Kolkata, they are very, very vulnerable. But at the same time, we have not really focused on Indian cities or developing Indian cities, thinking about this physical infrastructures in terms of the climate change challenge. So we had not done that. And it has been, I would say, like CPR, which is the Center for Policy Research, they are now doing a lot of research on this. And so I was involved in one of the roundtable discussions last year. And there, like, for example, there is one person called Radhika Bhardwaj and Ankit. So both of them, they are doing a lot of research. So one interesting thing they have done is that they have a paper where they have like it's a historiography paper. So where they have compiled all the works and everything, to understand like the scenario for Indian cities within the present context of climate change. And there they show that how the literature is so less, so scanty and scarce. And so far as policy making is concerned, I mean, we really still till date, we don't have any concrete or consolidated policies so far as these Indian cities are concerned. But again, like there are like different chapters, like Kolkata chapter or Bangalore chapter for that matter. And now, like the good news is that, for example, Kolkata, I know that a particular body now has been formed, which includes representatives from different sectors who will now work together to take care of or to mainly, kind of inculcate the local potentials of a particular city, or of Kolkata mainly, in terms of its geomorphology, but also in terms of the social negotiations among various actors. So that is there, but that body was actually formed. I mean, the discussions started since 2017, but then it got a bit slowed down. But now I think they are again, they have again started working on it. So that is the story. So I think, and again, as I mentioned, that each city has to concentrate on its own particular capacities. And Arjun also asked about like how do we plan for these disruptive risks. And so I there's again I read some works from IIED, because I'm quite influenced by this IIED center. And so they talked about this disruptive resilience. But they say, for example, it's previously the way we used to think about participatory, how that perspective will not make sense anymore, because we now already know the limitations, in the participatory approach. Because how, this the local people, their capacities, their strengths are not that much, these do not go into these so-called participatory approaches, which are participatory in official rhetoric, but they are not actually participatory in terms of realities. So why we really need to have a real participatory approach by making these local assert their voices, and also learning from their, and not only learning but also capacitating, the bottom-up needs-based practices that are already there in cityscapes. So in most of the areas, for example, I talk about peri-urbanization, and I talked about how the peri-urban spaces, they lack infrastructure, but how do they manage? So when there is dearth of policy-driven initiatives, we also find array of needs-driven local initiatives and practices, which are frugal innovations. Some of these are frugal innovations in that way. So, but these frugal innovations can teach us a lot of lessons. So why it is important for us to kind of really compile and learn a lot from these bottom-up needs-driven practices, and kind of include them in the policy-driven sets of ideas and ideals. So one example could be this, that how how disruptive resilience can be different from so-called mainstream or conventional model of resilience. So there are plenty of examples. So I think my personal take on this is to keep observing, to kind of apply detailed ethnography, to talk to these various people, and kind of draw or come up with a matrix that provides a lot of information about everything. And then as researchers, we can focus on the opportunities, I guess, to optimize on what we already have, rather than thinking about large scale investment laden laudable projects, because this investment laden laudable projects finally we all of us know that who are going to make profits out of these laudable schemes. So yes.
So, may I now ask Dr. Simi Mehta, who is the CEO of IMPRI, to chip in into our discussion, and if she wants to make any comments or if she has any questions. Yes, Simi, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Good evening, all of you. Thank you, sir, Dr. Somadeep, and Dr. Genia. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I commend you for making such a wonderful discussion, and I'm sure it is leading to a number of observations from different scholars who have gathered here this evening. It is, in fact, always a pleasure to listen to you. I attended one in person in Kolkata during the Smart
Thank you.
Cities workshop. I'm sorry I'm not able to turn on the video because of very low bandwidth. So, ma'am, I have one theoretical observation to make. Uh, and you may choose to respond if it is okay with you. So when you talk about the framework of urban political ecology, and Dr. Somadeep also touched upon the local and indigenous knowledge. There are a number of post-colonial and decolonial dialogues which focus on the local and indigenous framework of urban political ecology. However, these do not receive as much global attention due to the so-called quote-unquote West focus. Often there is a superimposition of a West-centric idea that that relegates local research and local knowledge as being parochial, as being in silos, operating in silos, and also lacking engagement. What does this imply on the larger policy making of if we take the example of India, that has again its implications on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, for example? So, do you think, essentially, do you think that drawing from the local knowledge, which does not receive as much policy attention from outside, would yield to anything at all? But ultimately, those at the receiving end would be people at the community level.
Right.
Yes, ma'am. That is my
Yes,
question to you.
yes,
Thank you so much again.
Yeah, thank you, Simi. Thanks a lot for those kind words, and also for asking this important question. So, again, what I find is that, again, unfortunately, my reflection would be to a great extent like Kolkata centric, and hence like little biased, because so that Eastern bias would be there. So, and I cannot manage it, neither can I hide it. So I need just to be open about it, and openly confess that yes, I am biased, because like to a great extent I see things from lessons that I actually learned from this Kolkata research. So again, from this Kolkata research, what I understand is that on one hand, this indigenous technologies, indigenous ideas, indigenous practices have been designated or described or considered as, or maybe castigated as parochial by the international agencies or by the West on one hand. But on the other hand, there is again another note of caution that in today what we find is that largely this is being romanticized and eulogized in a great in a great deal of way. So for example, take the example of wastewater fisheries, on the peri-urban interface of Kolkata, and these are absolutely projected and portrayed as locally owned and locally managed, and as example of this low cost folk technology. And you just type East Kolkata wetlands in Google and find out any article, any write-up, any video on East Kolkata wetlands, and you will find the same story. But then I would tell you that, it's, I mean, it's wrong. Understanding East Kolkata wetlands as a locally owned, locally managed system is absolutely wrong, because several other sectors like the KMC, like the Department of Fisheries, the government, the state, everyone is involved in this whole story. So the way wastewater is managed in these wetlands, it definitely involves like local skill and wisdom, that these locals to a great extent, they do it. I mean, there has been an intergenerational transmission of knowledge, no doubt about this, but it is not absolutely locally run, and neither it emerged it emerged or neither was it innovated by the local people. Because, like, for example, if you take a look into the urban environmental history of Kolkata, you will see that when the British designed the outfall scheme, so they used the river Vidyadhari, which I told you earlier, that they used the river Vidyadhari as the major outfall channel, and which finally dumped the effluent in the saltwater lakes. But saltwater lakes, and finally which was also connected to the Sundarbans Delta. But when this river Vidyadhari was declared to be dead in 1928, and Kulti outfall scheme was implemented, the project, the design was done by the municipal engineer, Dr. B.N. Dey, in 1940s, early 1940s, in 1931-40, right? And there he talked about the implementation of sedimentation tanks. There he talked about that, why don't we think about a system through which the locals can actually excavate the artery, the locally excavated canals. The locals can actually excavate these different arteries, which can get connected to the primary canals, the dry weather flows and the storm weather flow canals, and then the locals can be trained, through which they can actually pursue piscicultural activities. So we see that it was part of the municipal project. But unfortunately, Dhrubajyoti Ghosh also, number of times, like, I had conflicts with him on this issue, because I was not ready to kind of accept this system as a local system. Till date, for example, I can share some articles or some works with you, where I have, for example, mapped like the different actors, the different sectors and the different networks who are involved in this regulation of wastewater, in the distribution of wastewater, in the management of wastewater, in this recycling of wastewater, everything. So number of activities going on. So often, so we need to be very careful that, I mean, what are we considering as indigenous? So is this indigenous also a kind of a very, how do I say, like, is it a very sacrosanct category? So these are the questions we also need to raise. So on the one hand, yes, indigeneity has been ignored, has been castigated, has been all negative things we can discuss. But we also have become so hypercharged with indigeneity that now whatever we see immediately, we like to kind of conceptualize these as indigenous. So which is again also problematic. So I think it's important for us to really kind of capture the comprehensive composite whole, by joining the various dots, rather than just, kind of getting exposed to 2 or 3 dots and then saying, this is the story. It should not work like that. And there is the danger. So the danger of a single story. So it is important for us to, move beyond this single story and to do a comprehensive coverage of everything that is there in a cityscape.
More details on Kolkata wasteland and wastewater management on #PlanetTalksSimia next year. Very beautiful pictures, Jenia ma'am.
Yeah, certainly. That's what was coming to my mind. Thank you so much, ma'am, for this.
I really thought ma'am will show more pictures from that. But next year, really, on the regional part of that story, next year we will.
Next year, if things get normalized, you can also organize a trip to the Kolkata wetlands. That would be wonderful. We can arrange a workshop in the wetlands itself. Collaborating with the people who are involved. IIT Kharagpur can be a partner. Soumyadip sir is there, so everyone together we can organize a workshop.
Yes, yes.
This really sounds very exciting. We can discuss. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yes. Somadip sir, there was one question.
Yes, yes.
Also, it came an email. Yes, I sent.
Yes, so it's a question from Mr. Shubham Swarup. He's a former research officer at the Chennai Center for China Studies think tank. And his question is, what are some of the challenges for regulating the environmental impacts of trade in urban centers of India? And what opportunities or barriers they present for business investors towards participating and developing a national environmental policy? So it's there in your chat box. So if you please see, and if you have any comments on it, so it's there in your chat box.
Yes. So I can see some of the challenges for regulating environmental
Yes.
impacts of
So
trade.
just yes, just a quick thought, if you have any.
No, I don't think this is my area at all.
Exactly. So
yes, but yeah, because we are like we are trained to think in the other way around.
Other way. I understand, and that's why when you were saying about the Hugh methodology, so I was also a little bit like thinking like how to understand this Hugh methodology, because it's a very new thing to us now. We do not see the urban problems through this lens.
Yes,
we use the lens of urban informality. That is fine, but because I'm personally not very much familiar with that Hugh framework, but nevertheless, it sounds very attractive to me. So I'll be in touch with you regarding.
No, sure. I'll be very happy to share my book with you. So no problem. But sorry, Shubham, Mr. Shubham, I really don't have any answer to this because and it will not be right for me to provide my comment, because my comment in any case is not going to make you happy.
No, it's fine. So now, Arjuna, yes, I'm saying Mr. Samir Unale sir is with us. So if you please introduce him and so that he can offer some of his comments or observation. Please introduce.
Yes, right. Let me also add Shubham's question in a different way. That ma'am, in your in your framework, since you are also mentioning that there is a lot of informality in the city, most of the urban growth, degrowth, or whatever growth, misgrowth, which is happening, it is led by economic activities or businesses. Or let me put it in a framework that how do you see economic activities or the growth in your framework? So as per to see how significant are those and how to go forward about it. And let me quickly to have a administrative point of view to your presentation, invite Mr. Samir Unale. Mr. Samir Unale sir is a joint commissioner of municipal administration at government of Maharashtra. He was also earlier CEO of Smart City, Thane Smart City. So without any wasting any time, sir, are you there?
Hello.
Yes, please go on. Yes.
Sorry. Yeah. So I think first of all, the topic I found was very interesting because it does touch the immediate concerns and needs that most of the cities would be facing. As we keep on saying, the urban system is getting extremely complex. It is getting impacted by various sectors. It has many implications which are beyond the routine administrative steps that we take. And this interconnection requires a lot of cross-sectoral thinking and intersectoral coordination, which is a new thing which is coming up entirely, in most of the administrative issues. Because the statutes are there, as we are aware, there is no legislative vacuum, so to say, in India, because most of the sectors have been taken care of. And the entire framework and system that we have of legislations of, even the Honorable Supreme Court has also taken steps wherever they are required. So the challenge then really becomes of implementation and execution. And the concerns that have been raised, they have been intent of the statute in the legislations, and when it is to be implemented, the two factors directly impinge on the ability of the city to execute the whatever intents they have. One, of course, is the political will. Secondly, of course, is the intersectoral collaboration and the community engagement that you have, that is required for making anything really work on. One of the examples in the city and environment, or in fact the climate actions that you look for, I think one of the best examples you can look at was the Swachh Bharat mission, which was implemented in the cities. 4,000 cities of India were actively participated in this program. And if you look at the prevalence of the sanitation and service management, maybe a 10 years, 5 years back, before the mission started, and what you're looking now, you will definitely see that there is a tremendous change in that. So making a country of a size of a subcontinent, and maybe the population of 3 continents put together, making it happen at national level in India is extremely important challenge. And maybe we may not adopt or accept our achievements, but believe me, making a country of 1.4 billion people and have widest possible geographical and other difference that we have, that is something very rare, and I think that's a good thing which is happening. Similarly, on environmental level, as we know, many legislations are there. I could share one of the example that we're trying to do now, which is of we are having a Vasundhara, Maji Vasundhara movement. Vasundhara is another Marathi word for earth, and it's a movement of tackling all the 5 elements of nature, as we call in Indian context the Panchamahabhut. There is the air, the water, the land, and all aspects. Tree plus. So we are trying a new sort of an approach here of getting a community or a city or a village level activity which would focus on environmental improvement across sector for that particular locality. It will have the the focusing and prioritizing environmental aspect at city level beyond the legislations and beyond the reviews. I think is an experiment that is being tried. And the method and the earlier experiences we had in such city-led and community-led and community engagement activities in earlier years is I think this is something new that is getting tried, and of course it is just launched 2 months back. But city and environment, the interaction of city and environment, and focusing and marshalling the resources to make a city environment better than what it is now, with community engagement, with political prioritization, is something which could be of help for other states also to make sure how environmental aspects and issues at community level can be addressed. We do see a lot of international activism, a lot of international activities happening, a lot of think tanks, a lot of funding is coming up. And of course, with the global framework, as we keep on saying, of new urban agenda, of sustainable development goal, of climate challenges of climate change, cities are going to be the main tools and main instruments of making this happen. And there is much more greater need of international collaboration. Many cities are interacting at international forum, at formal, at informal level. Various networks are now getting very active, which are focused on particular aspect and element, maybe of environment, maybe of climate, maybe of resilience, maybe of green energy. A lot of international collaboration networks are happening to see that there is greater interaction, collaboration beyond the formal channels. So I believe a lot of so these are the new trends, which we are seeing at international level as well as national level, in which environmental aspect and the city's role in that is seeing a new dimension, which is beyond the routine, beyond being reactive and just being tried to face various litigations in various fora. I think this new form should be of help, and this new trend could be emulated, could be further encouraged in other states and other countries as well. That was my take, Arjunji, on the aspects of what as for administration and and city and environment intersections are concerned. So thank you, Arjun. Thank you.
Yes, Jenia ma'am, would you like to reflect upon
No,
something?
I was just thinking about this. Sir was talking about this, intersectoral coordination, and I told this that recently media projected that, but so not recently, like from 2015, this is going on. Like media has projected that the irrigation water department, it has actually deliberately tried to not provide wastewater to the East Kolkata wetlands, because the idea is to snuff out fisheries, so that because wastewater is the backbone of East Kolkata wetlands. So if these fishers are deprived of wastewater, then they would be compelled to sell their fisheries to the promoters, and real estate speculation will go on. So the idea is that there is a technical arrangement. So like if the water can flow at the point of like 7.5 GTS, then only the inlet canals can draw water through gravity from these primary canals. So, but then what was happening was that irrigation was not, at the Bantola regulator gate, the irrigation department, they instead of 7.5 GTS, they kept the level at 9 GTS. So due to that, what was happening was that wastewater was directly, reaching the outfall, reaching the Kulti channel. So two impacts of that. One is that, the fisheries were getting deprived of this wastewater, and on the other hand, the fisheries at Kulti was suffering, was getting affected. Why? Because these fisheries, they are not wastewater fisheries, so they are freshwater fisheries. So Kulti, Sundarbans was no more getting recycled water. So that was the problem. So then, so media projected it at, it was absolutely a kind of a deliberate attempt, this and that. So when I managed to talk to various people, just to to try to kind of address the crux of this problem. And then when I talked to this irrigation water department, they said, yes, we don't really encourage. Sometimes we have to channelize water at 9 GTS, and the fishers, they pressurize us to to make the water stagnant or get accumulated in the canal, so that whenever they need, they can take the water, right? But then if there is a downpour, even a little bit of downpour in the city of Kolkata, then if wastewater already remains in the primary canal, in the DWF, then there can be an immediate backlash, and there will be water logging in different wards of Kolkata. Then the same media will project that KMC, Kolkata Municipal Corporation, is not being able to tackle the climate crisis. So this irrigation water department is now, they are hard pressed, they're sandwiched between the needs of the fishers on one hand, and KMC compulsions or exigencies on the other. So what they do, they also do a lot of meetings, as I told, they meet, they discuss a lot of things they're attempting and trying. So it's not that it's only a very hierarchical, unequal game among various sectors. Because if you start with the fundamental premise that there is a lot of injustice, which is true, there is injustice, there is inequity, then you will be in no position to kind of optimizing on these potentials. So if I, for example, I'm a researcher, I'm an academician, so I go and meet the irrigation official, with this idea that you are not serving the purpose or the cause of the fisher. So you are deliberately, your system, it is deliberately affecting or harming the local needs. So you are a bureaucrat, so you are not taking care of the local. So if if I reach out to them with this kind of a perspective, so would they even like to collaborate or cooperate with us? So I think it's time for us to really pay a lot of reverence to this intersectoral collaboration and coordination, and connect these dots to nurture collective resilience. That is, I think, would be very, very important.
Yes, yes, sir is really highlighting that political will and then community action, I would say public will in our conscience, then only, or either we have some very strong leadership really coming from academician. Now academicians and all the researchers should really run for mayor to transform India. Yes, all the activists, I think then only. One thing I really wanted to highlight, since we are also discussing wasteland, and other thing, wetlands, and that what can our cities in the in west can learn from the east coast, or the west coast can learn from east coast in Mumbai, and other cities where also there are estuaries, there are delta, that thing, because there is really no communication. Odisha city, some of the Puri, and many such cities in Andhra, Telangana, those things are also happening, which are integrated part. uh, like so many rivers we have, there is I don't think much learning how that can also be integrated into some sort of knowledge, so that we experiment but we do not repeat our mistakes again and again, which is what really happening. So really thankful. I think we have really gone beyond our time limit. Samayadip sir, yes, over to you.
So yes,
Any
yes.
final
So,
thing, yes, or any final comment, Professor Mukherjee, really want to make? Yes.
so if you want to make any final comments, you can make, or else.
No,
So
no, I
think-
just want to
okay,
thank
okay.
you all. I just
Okay,
want
well,
to thank, I
so-
wanted to thank you all,
so-
and
so-
hope
so-
like we'll keep in touch, and our
so
discussions
it's-
will go on.
Sure, sure. It's really nice to hear you, Dr. Mukherjee, today. And what I get from today's discussion, if I put it in a very broad terms, like what I think is that it is important for us to work towards evolving a kind of robust framework that has the ability to radically change how Indian cities respond to the environmental challenges. And I think there are two principal axes. What I feel is that there are two principal axes for such changes. One is governance innovations, especially with some social reference to the bottom-up approaches. And then the other aspect is the creation of the effective implementation mechanism. And India has certain institutional architecture to undertake the meaningful action towards making cities livable and resilient. But India require the mapping existing programs on environmental action. And for example, with the SDG targets and ensure the judicious use of funds and a reorientation of action towards urban areas and so on. So let us be hopeful that we will be able to make our cities livable and as well as resilient. And once again, on behalf of Team IMPRI, we are thankful to you, Dr. Mukherjee, for your talk today, and we hope that you will join us, like you have already given us a proposal regarding joint workshop on East Kolkata
Yes. Wetlands, yeah.
Wetlands, yeah. So I think the IMPRI management, the director is here, the CEO is here. They will take a good note of it, and we will come up with some workshop or something like that. So thank you once again.
Thank you.
And
Thanks
good
a lot.
evening. Good evening.
Good
Have a
evening,
good day.
yeah.
Have a good
Thank
day.
Have a
you.
nice evening. Thank
Have
you
a
so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thanks. Bye. Bye.